Okay, welcome everyone. It's 6 o'clock now, so we'll get started with our presentation this evening. Thank you all for joining us. And my name is Karen Drummond, and I'm the Manager of Community Engagement. We're here this evening to talk about some possible changes to CBE school calendars. And we have some leaders who are here with us that I'd like to introduce. Sorry, okay, great. So we have Charlene May, trustee, wards 12 and 14. And it's possible we may have other trustees joining us as well this evening if they were able to make it. So welcome to our trustees, and glad that you can join us. Andrea Holoka, the superintendent of school improvement. Marla actually is not joining us this evening, but is certainly part of our team and participating actively in this engagement process. We have Tori Healing, Education Director for Area 2. We have Prem Randawa, Education Director for Area 3. Melody Pelling, Education Director for Area 3 as well. And Lisa Noctegal, Education Director for Area 4. Myself and Adele Lowther, Community Engagement Advisor. So I'm happy to have everyone joining us here this evening. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, before we get into the agenda and content for our session today, we want to acknowledge the land. We're making this acknowledgement at the beginning of our gathering today to demonstrate our commitment to work together as a community in laying the foundation for reconciliation through education. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. And as we go through our agenda for this evening, I'll just note that we do have a presentation that we're going to run through at the outset. And then we will move into some breakout groups where we can have some discussion and you can share some of your perspectives on some digital whiteboards that we have. So we will try to provide you with the information that you need about the current situation, our rationale, and what it means to operate on 2 calendars, as well as talking a little bit about the engagement process and next steps before we move into the discussion groups. And so with that, I will now hand things over to Andrea Holoka to share a little more information with you on our current situation and more.
Thanks, Karen. So I'm just going to start with a very high-level overview of our current situation. And you can see on the slide that we're identifying we have 28 regular program schools that operate on the modified instructional calendar. So that's 28 out of about the 250 CBE schools we have. So the other amount of schools, over 220, operate on the traditional instructional calendar. So over the years, we have certainly had some challenge that has emerged because there have been changes to attendance areas and school programming, as well as understanding the challenges that have arisen for families, as well as operations of the school system. The modified calendar does not result in higher achievement within the CBE, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we also recognize that school composition has changed quite a bit, which means there's different families in place than when some of these decisions were made years ago. And so that's why it's really important for us to engage with our families at this time so we can understand the impact of the calendar on our current families. And we'll go, like I said, we'll go into a bit more detail on these in later slides as well. So going to the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the difference between the two calendars. So it's important to note that we actually have the same type of curriculum and quality regardless of the calendar. So we follow the Alberta Education curriculum, and so the curriculum is mandated for us, as are the days of education that we must hold. So that is, all those pieces are mandated for us. The breaks in the school year actually are the only differences we experience. So we have different breaks for our modified calendar schools than the traditional calendar. So the modified calendar schools have a shorter summer break by about 2 weeks. There's a week-long break in October. There's a 3-week winter break where there's only a 2-week winter break for our traditional calendar schools. And then for our spring break is a week longer in the modified calendar schools than it is in the traditional calendar. So one question that you might be thinking of is, why don't we move all of our schools to the modified calendar? Well, one of the perspectives that is important to note is that we want to have alignment with other school boards. It improves our operations systemically and across the province. It's also difficult for us to be able to hold regular programs, high schools, on a modified calendar. And the reason for that is twofold. One is that the diploma examinations occur at a set time that is set by the government of Alberta, which is really based on a traditional calendar school year. And the other component of that is that we have many of our students who take advantage of taking summer school. And because of that, again, the summer break is very important to ensure that students have that opportunity. And then lastly, many parents and guardians who work for employers have built their work cycles around traditional calendars that exist with the longer break in the summer and not accounting for the breaks during the school year that occur in the modified calendar. So we did do a student data review, and I did mention this on a previous slide. So earlier this year, we wanted to really understand the impact of the calendar between the modified calendar schools and the traditional calendar schools to see if it had any significant outcomes when it comes to looking at student attendance and achievement. So we selected twin schools and compared the twin schools against each other. It's important to note that the twin schools had similar equity index scores, geographic locations. They had the same programming within each school. They had about the same percentages of coded students, and the enrollment sizes were approximately the same as well. So the only really significant difference between the twin schools was actually their calendar. And the initial thought and why we went into this was that perhaps there were some advantages, and I think that is why the schools were selected years ago to move into a modified calendar, was the thought and good intention of perhaps it providing academic or attendance outcomes that were improved by that calendar. So going into this data review allowed us to explore if that is truly what was happening now within the CBE. And our analysis showed that the modified calendar does not result in higher achievement within the CBE, and it doesn't result in higher or different attendance outcomes either. So there really is no advantage academically or through attendance by having the modified calendar. What we have heard, though, significantly for some of our families is that it's very challenging for them to deal with the scheduling misalignment when they have siblings following 2 different calendars. And we know that's a reality for some of our families across the system when they might have students in elementary, middle, junior, or high schools that are operating on different calendars depending on the school they are registered in. Changing one calendar in one area might seem like a good solution, and we'll give you a bit of an explanation with some tangible examples in a moment, but it actually creates challenges with other groupings. So when school communities change calendars on an individual basis, what can occur is creating new challenges as we create a cascading effect of how it creates new misalignments for new sets of schools. We also recognize that calendars might be acting as drivers for program selection. So things like language programs or alternative programs that exist only on one calendar or the other might be difficult for parents to make the selection for that program if it's not on a calendar that aligns with the siblings that they're trying to support, or a calendar that's more conducive to what they can support at home. And there are some challenges and benefits to childcare, and we certainly have heard those anecdotally from some of our parents, and we do see some of that also in research. So I am going to go through a few examples of schools with calendar changes. This is not an exhaustive list of the 28 schools, but the challenges presented here today just give you a snapshot of how the complexity exists for these schools and their surrounding communities. So the first one there is Catherine Nichols Gun. So currently it sits on a modified calendar, but the challenge for that community and the surrounding communities is the misalignment that it has with Sir John A. Macdonald School and John G. Diefenbaker High School. Both of those sit on a traditional calendar, which means that when families who are in Catherine Nichols Gun then feed into Sir John A. Macdonald or John G. Diefenbaker High School, which are traditional, there's the misalignment for those families. Mayland Heights is another example. So they sit on a traditional calendar, but they are misaligned with Bob Edwards, which is a French school that would host a French program for them. But if we changed this school to a modified calendar school, it would create a misalignment with Colonel Mulcaud, which supports the English program that they would feed into. Likewise, we could go to Bob Edwards School, which is currently on a modified calendar, and look at transitioning them to a traditional calendar. But if done in isolation, there would then be new misalignment with Mayland Heights, or there'd be they are currently misaligned with Mayland Heights, but we would cause new misalignment with other elementary schools that feed into Bob Edwards programming that are currently on the modified calendar. So this is really just to show the cascading effect of moving one school and how the misalignment currently sits within our system. There's also some impact on our school operations that we are challenged with as a system. Centralized staff scheduling challenges are certainly a reality for us. There are some staff who definitely have preference for one calendar or another, but moving staff across schools to best suit the needs of the system, calendar can be a barrier to being able to do so. More often, challenges are presented in attracting or placing staff who prefer the traditional calendar. And there are also efficiencies to the system that can't be fully realized when we are operating two different calendars. For example, transportation routes. We could save within our system almost $100,000 if we were able to pair some of these routes together, but we are unable to maximize pairing of routes to different schools when they exist in different calendars. Similarly, where we decide where programs are going to be situated within schools can be limited because of the calendar that the school holds. Other pretty practical realities are trying to make sure our schools are safe and clean and repaired during the summer months. And certainly in our modified calendar schools, the time that our facilities and maintenance and construction staff can enter into schools to do that work is reduced. And we have professional learning opportunities that we need to provide at times for our staff before they enter the school year. This year was a good example where we had our new curriculum for our elementary schools, and we actually had to provide additional sessions for our modified calendar school teachers, which again just means there's another set of learning that we need to support, which is again an efficiency that we can't actualize by having just one set of sessions. And when we're looking at future student accommodation, where we're seeing growth in our schools moving forward, and we're looking at how can we accommodate that growth within our schools, again, we can't always benefit the schools to the greatest extent possible because they might be on different calendars. So with that, I believe I'm passing it back to Adele to walk us through the next steps about the decision to be made.
Thank you, Andrea. So given the current situation that Andrea outlined, the CBE is gathering feedback on the possibility of transitioning schools that currently operate on the modified calendar to the traditional calendar. and this could happen as early as the 2023-2024 school year. By December 15th, 2022, the CBE will communicate a decision about whether some or all schools currently operating on the modified calendar will move to the traditional calendar. And the final decision about this will be made at the superintendent level. And so that's the final decision about whether modified calendars will move to the traditional, modified calendar schools will move to the traditional calendar, as well as an implementation plan if the decision were made to move them. So this may mean that it's possible that some modified calendar schools will adopt the traditional calendar, while others will continue operating on the modified calendar. It's recommended that all schools transition to the traditional calendar, but other possibilities may be considered. So the CBE will gather feedback from those who are both directly and indirectly affected. This feedback is just one factor that will be considered in decision-making. Along with this feedback, equitable access to programming for all students, programming alignment, and operational requirements will also be considered before making a decision. Through this engagement process, the feedback we receive can influence whether or not a decision is made to move schools currently operating on the modified calendar to the traditional calendar. As mentioned earlier, other factors will also be considered, including equitable access to programming for all students, alignment with other programming, and operational requirements. So if a decision is made to move all schools to the traditional calendar, those people who are directly affected can influence factors related to implementing the decision, and this includes timing and other considerations. So there's also out of scope factors that cannot be influenced through this engagement process. And these include the days when schools are closed during the school year. So that includes non-instructional days, holidays, etc. And those are determined through an ongoing process that's separate from this engagement. Also, the number of instructional hours. So that's determined by the government of Alberta, school bell times, alternative and language program locations, and also schools that are currently operating on the traditional calendar will not move to the modified calendar. And as mentioned earlier, schools with unique settings won't be part of this engagement process. Their school calendars will continue to be set based on the particular needs of their student community. It's also important to understand that there are budget constraints that the CBE must consider in making financially responsible and sustainable decisions. And all CBE decision-making is guided by legislative and regulatory requirements set out by Alberta Education, as well as CBE policies and administrative regulations. So these out-of-scope factors, as well as the in-scope factors we spoke about, they're all listed in the engagement plan for this project, and they could be found on the project website. And the link to that will be on a slide a bit later in the presentation. So this is the timeline. So tomorrow and until October 19th, the online surveys will be available. And by November 15th, the CBE will share survey results. And by December 15th, the CBE will communicate a decision. So for the remainder of our time together this evening, we'd like to spend some time gathering your perspectives. But before I explain how it will work, I'd like to hand it back over to Andrea just for some closing remarks to conclude the presentation portion of this evening.
Thanks, Adele. Adele had explained that the decision will be made at the superintendent level, but I just really want to, on behalf of the superintendents, really express gratitude for your participation here today. I recognize that as families, you are all very busy. You're taking time out of your evening to provide this feedback to us. So we're very grateful for it. Engagement is really important to us with our communities, and that we're able to listen and receive some of the feedback that you have for us. So really appreciate hearing from all of you. And the purpose of the next section, which will be explained in a moment, will really be to gather that feedback. And your perspectives will be reviewed and considered along with those other factors that Adele had shared. And as superintendents, this will help us to make the best decision we can for the system. Over to you, Adele.